What's happening, everybody? This is Liberty Talk, and today I'm going to be doing one of the most important educational videos that I've ever done on this channel. And I'm also going to give you a little history lesson on why the right to keep and bear arms is probably our most important liberty in this country. And don't you ever wonder to yourself why other countries are so worried that we have guns? Why are they so worried about taking the guns out of the hands of the American people? The only reason that there is not already a socialist, totalitarian, new world order in this world is because the American people have the right to keep and bear arms. We are the only obstacle, the only thing standing in the way of the New World Order's agenda. That's why they want the guns out of our hands so badly. And I hope and I pray they never get them. I know they'll never get my guns, at least not until I'm dead. From my cold, dead hands is the only way that they'll get my guns. And I hope that we can preserve and protect this constitutional republic peacefully. But if all else fails, the right to keep and bear arms is actually given to us because the Founding Fathers wanted to make sure that we, the American people, could protect ourselves from a tyrannical government. Now, whether that be an invasion from another country, no country is stupid enough to invade us because they would be slaughtered. It would be a massacre. They would literally take casualties in every neighborhood they went into. That's why nobody invades us. They're not that stupid. We will probably never be invaded as long as we have guns. Also, the reason that we have the right to keep and bear arms is to protect ourselves from a tyrannical government in case the federal government ever goes rogue and we have to overthrow them and restore constitutional Republican government. The right to keep and bear arms must not be infringed. We must not allow it to be taken away. So, I'm going to give you a little bit of a lesson on some of the countries that have willingly become slaves and were just so happy about it for some strange reason because they were just more than happy to give away their guns. And those are the most stupid people on the face of the earth. Anyone that willingly turns in their weapons to their government is a fool. Remember that an armed man or woman is a free citizen. An unarmed man or woman is a subject. And there's a big difference. So, let's get into it. The disarmament of the German Jews started in 1933, initially limited to local areas. A major target was Berlin, where large-scale raids in search for weaponry took place. Starting in 1936, the Gestapo prohibited German police officers from giving firearms licenses to Jews. In November of 1938, there was a legislation passed that prohibited the possession of firearms and bladed weapons by the Jews. This ultimately led in the roundup and murder of 6 million people by the Socialist Nazi Party. That included Jews that had had their weapons taken from them by law, legal law procedures, because they had no Bill of Rights to protect their right to keep and bear arms. The legal foundations that the Nazi Party later used for the purposes of disarming the Jews were already laid during the Weimar Republic. The Weimar Republic was the government Germany had before Hitler became a dictator in 1933. and declared himself the Führer. So, starting with the Reich Law on Firearms and Ammunition, which was enacted on the 12th of April, 1928, weapon purchase permits were introduced. That sounds familiar. Which only allowed authorized persons the purchase and possession of firearms. Mandatory registration of weapons was introduced. Gee, that also sounds familiar, doesn't it? Which gave the government the opportunity of accessing weapon owners and their weapons at any given time. And that is the real reason, folks, that you have to register your weapons when you buy them. Manufacture and sale of weapons was only permitted if authorized. The purpose was to ensure that firearms were only issued to reliable individuals. Starting in 1930, bladed weapons were also regulated. The carrying of weapons in public now required a weapons permit. So it's important to note that this next little piece I'm about to read comes from the International Bar Association, which is the global voice of the legal profession. The global voice, notice that. Also notice they attack the American people several times in this piece, trying to get the guns out of our hands. And once again, why are they so worried about us having guns? It's because we're in their way. So this comes from the International Bar Association, the global voice of the legal profession. And they're referring to New Zealand here. Now, New Zealand, the Pacific nation, has introduced swift and sweeping reforms of gun laws following the mass shooting in Christchurch in March. A move that highlights the continuing lack of action to tackle gun violence in the United States. Folks, New Zealand has nothing to do with the United States. New Zealand is an independent country right beside Australia. So why would they need to worry about what's going on in the United States? One of New Zealand's darkest days, which was how the country's prime minister described the mass shooting in Christchurch on the 15th of March. 51 people were killed and 50 others were wounded when a lone gunman opened fire at 2 mosques in the city. In the country's worst peacetime shooting, the gunman live-streamed his actions on Facebook. Now, I want to go ahead and say here that I hate that that happened. I'm sorry for the victims of that tragedy. I truly am. But that's no reason to surrender your freedoms. Back to the article here. Less than a month later, New Zealand's parliament voted 119 to 1 to introduce a nationwide ban on semi-automatic weapons and assault rifles. I hate when they say that word. There is no such thing as an assault rifle. It's just a rifle. In addition to the sweeping reform of gun laws, a special commission is being set up to explore border issues around accessibility of weapons and the role of social media. Quote, Australia experienced a massacre and changed its laws. New Zealand has had its experience and changed its laws. I don't understand the United States, unquote, said the New Zealand Prime Minister. Well, you don't understand the United States because you don't know anything about liberty. Because you've just given up your liberty and your people's liberty because you have surrendered your arms. So you don't know anything about us because you don't know anything about freedom. The people of Australia were also fooled into becoming slaves with the National Firearms Agreement. Now, the National Firearms Agreement, which is also sometimes called the National Agreement on Firearms, the National Firearms Agreement and Buyback Program, or the Nationwide Agreement on Firearms, was an agreement concerning firearm control made by Australian Police Ministers' Council in 1996 in response to the Port Arthur massacre that killed 35 people. 4 days after the killings, Australian Prime Minister John Howard told Parliament, quote, "We need to achieve a total prohibition on the ownership, possession, sale, and importation of all automatic and semi-automatic weapons. That will be the essence of the proposal that will be put by the Commonwealth Government at the meeting on Friday," unquote. The laws to give effect to the agreement were passed by Australian state governments only 12 days after the Port Arthur massacre. Now you start to notice here a very common reoccurrence in all these countries. These horrible tragedies are used to enslave the population of these countries. Once again, I'm sorry for the victims of these tragedies, but it is no excuse to surrender your liberties. I prefer dangerous freedom over peaceful slavery. Thomas Jefferson said that, and I agree with him 100%. The agreement included a number of provisions. It was agreed to establish a temporary firearm buyback program for firearms that were once legal but now were made illegal. That according to the Council on Foreign Relations, bought over 650,000 firearms. Could you imagine that many stupid people in one country happily, with a smile on their face, giving away the only thing that could ensure their freedom? What a group of idiots. What a group of absolute fools. This program, which cost $230 million, was paid for by an increase in the country's taxes. That's the funniest part to me. Not only did they willingly become slaves, but they had to pay higher taxes for their slavery. Oh my God. The law created a national firearm registry, a 28-day waiting period for firearm sales, and tightened firearm licensing rules. The law requires anyone wishing to possess or use a firearm with some expectations to be over the age of 12. Owners must be at least 18 years of age, have secure storage for their firearms, and provide a genuine reason for doing so. You see, ladies and gentlemen, in the New World Order, just wanting to protect yourself and your family is not good enough. You need to have a genuine reason to own guns. Now we start to see that, the United States of America is the only country that ever set the common man and woman free for the first time that they had ever been set free. That's why America is called the Great Experiment. And one of our most important liberties is the right to keep and bear arms. And David B. Kopel would agree with me. He is the author of The American Revolution Against British Gun Control. He is an American author, attorney, a gun rights advocate, and a contributing editor to several publications. And also, if I might add, he is a fellow American patriot that believes that the common man and woman can govern themselves, and he also believes that the right to keep and bear arms is one of the most important liberties that we possess. This article reviews the British gun control program that participated in the American Revolution, the 1774 import ban on firearms and gunpowder, the 1774 through 1775 confiscations of firearms and gunpowder, and the use of violence to officiate the confiscations. It was these events that changed the situation to a political tension and a shooting war. into a shooting war. Each of these British abuses provides insights into the scope of the modern Second Amendment. Now, this article is written by David B. Kopel, and it is called The American Revolution Against British Gun Control. Furious at the December 1773 Boston Tea Party, Parliament in 1774 passed the Cohesive Act, or the Coercive Act, also known to the Americans as the Intolerable Acts. The particular provisions of the Cohesive Acts were offensive to Americans, but it was the possibility that the British might deploy the army to enforce them that primed many colonists for armed resistance. The Patriots of Lancaster County, Pennsylvania resolved that, quote, that in the event of Great Britain attempting to force unjust laws upon us by the strength of arms, our cause we leave to heaven and our rifles, unquote. A South Carolina newspaper essay reprinted in Virginia urged that any law that had to be enforced by the military was necessarily illegitimate. See, that's what's so beautiful about the United States of America. Freedom will reign when free men and women own the right to keep and bear arms. Because only when we own the right to keep and bear arms do we get to dictate what is just and what is unjust. That's the difference between a citizen and a subject. The royal governor of Massachusetts, General Thomas Gage, had forbidden town meetings from taking place more than once a year. When he dispatched the Redcoats to break up an illegal town meeting in Salem, 3,000 armed Americans appeared in response, and the British retreated. Gage's aide, John Andrews, explained that everyone in the area aged 16 years or older owned a gun and plenty of gunpowder. Military rule would be difficult to impose on an armed populace. Gage had only 2,000 troops in Boston. There were thousands of armed men in Boston alone, and more in the surrounding area. One response to the problem was to deprive the Americans of gunpowder. Modern smokeless gunpowder is stable under most conditions. The black powder of the 18th century was far more volatile. Accordingly, large quantities of black powder were often stored in a town's powder house, typically a reinforced brick building. The powder house would hold merchants' reserves, large quantities stored by individuals, as well as powder for use by the local militia. Militia is not a bad word. Militia. Although colony laws generally required militiamen and sometimes all householders to have their own firearm and a minimum quantity of powder, not everyone could afford it. Consequently, the government, now listen to this part very carefully, the government sometimes supplied public arms and powder to individual militiamen. Could you imagine that? Could you imagine the federal government today even admitting the militia is a necessary thing for the American people to protect the Constitution, much less giving the militia guns? Imagine that. Imagine that. Policies varied on whether militiamen who had been given public arms would keep them at home. Public arms were often to be stored in special armories, which might also be called powder houses. Before dawn of September the 1st, 1774, 260 of Gage's redcoats sailed up the Mystic River and seized hundreds of barrels of powder from the Charleston Powder House. The powder alarm, as it became known, was a serious provocation. By the end of the day, 20,000 militiamen, militia is a wonderful thing in this country that should be revisited by very young generations that know nothing about it. The militia should always be formed when the Republic and the Constitution are in danger. And that was Eli talking. That was Eli Shepherd talking. Now I will get back to the article. The powder alarm, as it was known, was a serious provocation. By the end of the day, 20,000 militiamen had mobilized and started marching towards Boston. In Connecticut and western Massachusetts, rumors quickly spread that the powder alarm had actually involved fighting in the streets of Boston. More accurate reports reached the militia companies. Before that, militia reached Boston. And so the war did not begin in September. The message, though, was unmistakable. If the British used violence to seize arms or gunpowder, the Americans would treat the violent seizure as an act of war. And this is Eli talking again, as we should also treat the federal government, the ATF, and the FBI as an act of war if they come to our homes and attempt to take our guns from us. It will be an act of war against the American people. And back to the article. And would fight. And that is exactly what happened several months later on April the 19th, 1775. 5 days after the powder alarm on September the 6th, the militia of the towns of Worcester County assembled on the Worcester Common. Backed by the formidable Aria, the Worcester Convention took over the reins of the government and ordered the resignations of all militia officers who had received their commissions from the royal governor. The officers promptly resigned and then received new commissions from the Worcester Convention. That same day, the people of Suffolk County, which includes Boston, assembled and adopted the Suffolk resolutions. The 19th point resolutions complied about the powder alarm and then took control of the local militia away from the royal governor by replacing the governor's appointed officers with officers elected by the militia, and resolved to engage in group practice with arms at least weekly. The First Continental Congress, which had assembled in Philadelphia, unanimously endorsed the Suffolk resolutions and urged that all other colonies to send supplies to help the Bostonese. Governor Gage directed the Redcoats to begin general warrantless searches for arms and ammunition. According to the Boston Gazette, all of General Gage's offenses, quote, what must irritate the people, unquote, was seizing their arms and ammunition. When the Massachusetts Assembly convened, General Gage declared it illegal, so the representatives reassembled at the Provincial Congress on October the 26th, 1774. The Massachusetts Provincial Congress adopted a resolution condemning military rule and criticizing Gage for unlawfully seizing and retaining large quantities of ammunition in the arsenal at Boston. The Provincial Congress urged all militia companies to organize and elect their own officers. At least a quarter of the militia, the famous Minutemen, were directed to equip and hold themselves in readiness to march at the shortness of a notice. The Provincial Congress further declared that everyone did not already have a gun should get one and start practicing with it diligently. In flagrant defiance of royal authority, the Provincial Congress appointed a committee of safety and vested it with the power to call forth the militia. The militia of Massachusetts was now the instrument of what was becoming an independent government of Massachusetts. Lord Dartmouth, the Royal Secretary of State for America, sent Gage a letter on October the 17th, 1774, urging him to disarm New England. Gage replied that he would like to do so, but it was impossible without the use of force. After Gage's letter was made public by a reading in the British House of Commons, it was publicized in America as proof of Britain's horrible tyrannical intentions. 2 days after Lord Dartmouth dispatched his disarmament recommendation, King George III and his ministers blocked importation of arms and ammunition to America. Read literally, the order merely required permit to export arms or ammunition from Great Britain to America. In practice, no permits were actually ever granted. Meanwhile, Benjamin Franklin was masterminding the import of arms and ammunition from the Netherlands, France, and Spain. The patriotic Boston Committee of Correspondence learned of the arms embargo and promptly dispatched Paul Revere to New Hampshire with the warning that 2 British ships were headed to Fort William and Mary, North Portsmouth, New Hampshire, to seize firearms, cannons, and gunpowder. On December the 14th, 1774, 400 New Hampshire patriots preemptively captured all the material at the fort. A New Hampshire newspaper argued that the capture was prudent and proper, reminding readers that the ancient Carthaginians had consented to deliver up all their arms to the Romans and were decimated by the Romans soon after. In Parliament, a moderate minority favored coalition with America. Among the moderates was the Duke of Manchester, who warned that America now had 3 million people, and most of them were trained to use arms. He was certain they could produce a stronger army than Great Britain. The Massachusetts Provincial Congress offered to purchase as many arms and bayonets as could be delivered to the next session of the Congress. Massachusetts also urged American gunsmiths diligently to apply themselves to making guns for everyone who did not already have a gun. A few weeks earlier, the Congress had resolved, quote, that it be strongly recommended to all the inhabitants of this colony to be diligently attentive to learning to the use of arms, unquote. Derived from political and legal philosophers such as John Locke, Hugo Grotius, and Edward Coke, the ideology underlining all forms of American resistance was explicitly premised on the right of self-defense of all inalienable rights. From the Self-Defense Foundation was constructed a political theory in which the people were the masters and the government was the servant, so that the people have the right to remove a disobedient servant. The British government was not, in a purely formal sense, attempting to abolish the Americans' common law right to self-defense. Yet in practice, that was precisely what the British were attempting. First, by disarming the more difficult. Second, and more fundamentally, the Americans made no distinction between self-defense against a lone criminal or against a criminal government. To the Americans and to their British Whig ancestors, the right of self-defense necessarily implied the right of armed self-defense against tyranny. The troubles in New England inflamed the other colonies. Patrick Henry's great speech to the Virginia legislature on March the 23rd, 1775, argued that the British plainly meant to subjugate America by force, because every attempt by the Americans at peaceful reconciliation had been rebuffed. The only remaining alternatives for the Americans were to accept slavery or to take up arms. If the Americans did not act soon, the British would soon disarm them, and all hope would be lost. The millions of people armed in the holy cause of liberty and such a country as that which we possess are indivisible by any force which our enemy can send against us, he promised. The convention formed a committee including Patrick Henry, Richard Henry Lee, George Washington, and Thomas Jefferson, to prepare a plan for the embodying, arming, and disciplining such number of men as may be sufficient to defend the Commonwealth. The convention urged that every man may be provided with a good rifle, and that every horseman be provided with pistols and holsters, a carbine or flintlock. When the Virginia militiamen assembled a few weeks later, many more canvas hunting shirts adorned with the motto, "Liberty or Death." In South Carolina, patriots established the government headed by the General Committee. The government described the British arms embargo as a plot to disarm the Americans in order to enslave them. Thus, the committee recommended that all persons should immediately provide themselves with a large quantity of ammunition. Without formal legal authorization, Americans began to form independent militia outside the traditional chain of command of the royal governors. In Virginia, George Washington and George Mason organized the Fairfax Independent Militia Company. The Fairfax militia pledged that, quote, "we will, each of us, constantly keep by us a flintlock, 6 pounds of gunpowder, and 20 pounds of lead." Other independent militia embodied in Virginia along the same model. Independent militia also formed in Connecticut, Rhode Island, New Hampshire, Maryland, and South Carolina, choosing their own officers. John Adams praised the newly constituted Massachusetts militia, commanded through the province not by men who procured their commissions from a governor as a reward by making themselves pimps to his tool. The American War of Independence began April the 19th, 1775, when 700 redcoats under the command of Major John Pitcairn left Boston to seize American arms at Lexington and Concord. The militia that assembled at the Lexington Green and the Concord Bridge consisted of able-bodied men aged 16 to 60. They supplied their own firearms, although a few poor men had to borrow a gun. Warned by Paul Revere and Samuel Dawes, the British advised, of the British advance, the young woman of Lexington assembled cartridges late into the evening of April the 18th. At dawn, the British confronted about 200 militiamen at Lexington. "Disperse, ye rebels! Damn you! Throw down your arms!" said the British. The Americans quickly routed. With a huzzah of victory, the Redcoats marched on Concord, where one of Gage's spies had told him the largest Patriot reserve of gunpowder was stored. At Concord's North Bridge, the town militia met with some of the British force, and after a battle that lasted about 2 or 3 minutes, drove off the British regulars. Notwithstanding the setback at the bridge, the Redcoats had sufficient force to search the town for arms and ammunition. But the main powder stores at Concord had been hauled to safety before the Redcoats arrived. When the British began to withdraw back to Boston, things got much worse for them. Armed Americans swarmed in from nearby towns. They would soon outnumber the British 2 to 1. Although some of the Americans cohered in military units, a great many fought on their own, taking sniper positions wherever the opportunity presented itself. Only British reinforcements dispatched from Boston saved the British expedition from annihilation, and the fact that the Americans started running out of ammunition and gunpowder. One British officer reported, quote, "These fellows were genuinely good marksmen, and many of them used long guns made for duck shooting," unquote. On a per-shot basis, the Americans inflicted higher casualties than the British regulars ever dared to. That night, the American militiamen began laying siege in Boston, where General Gage's standing army was located. At dawn, Boston had been the base from which the King's army could project force into New England. Now, it was trapped in the city, surrounded by people in arms. 2 days later in Virginia, royal authorities confiscated 20 barrels of gunpowder from the public magazine in Williamsburg and destroyed the public firearms there by removing their fire mechanisms. In response to complaints manifested by more visible than the mustering of a large independent militia led by Patrick Henry, Governor Dunmore delivered a legal note promising to pay restitutions. At Lexington and Concord, forcible disarmament had not worked out for the British. So back in Boston, Gage set out to disarm the Bostonians in a different way. On April the 23rd, 1775, Gage offered the Bostonians the opportunity to leave town if they surrendered their arms. The Boston Select Men voted to accept the offer, and within days, 2,674 guns were deposited, 1 gun for every 2 adult male Bostonians. Gage thought that many Bostoners still had guns, and he refused to allow the Bostonians to leave. Indeed, a large proportion of the surrounding guns were training arms, large muskets with bayonets that would be difficult to hide. After several months, food shortages in Boston convinced Gage to allow easier immigration from the city. Gage's disarmament program incited other Americans to take up arms. Benjamin Franklin, returning to Philadelphia after an unsuccessful diplomatic trip to London, was highly pleased to find the Americans arming and preparing for the worst events. The government in London dispatched more troops and 3 more generals to America: William Howe, Henry Clinton, and John Burgoyne. The generals arrived on May the 25th, 1775, with orders from Lord Dodmouth to seize all arms in public armories, or which had been, quote, secretly collected together for the purpose of aiding rebellions, unquote. The war underway, the Americans captured Fort Ticonderoga in upstate New York. At the June 17th Battle of Bunker Hill, the militia held its ground against British regulars and inflicted heavy casualties until they ran out of gunpowder and were finally driven back. Now, had Gage not confiscated the gunpowder from Charleston Powder House the previous September, the Battle of Bunker Hill probably would have resulted in an outright defeat for the British. On June the 19th, Gage renewed his demand for the Bostons to surrender their arms, and he declared that anyone found in possession of arms would be deemed guilty of treason. Meanwhile, the Continental Congress had voted to send 10 companies of riflemen from Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Virginia to aid Massachusetts militia. On July 1775, the Continental Congress adopted the Declaration of Causes and Necessity of Taking Up Arms, written by Thomas Jefferson and the great Pennsylvania lawyer John Dickinson. Among the grievances were General Gage's efforts to disarm people of Lexington, Concord, and Boston. 2 days later, the Continental Congress sent an open letter to the people of Great Britain, warning that, quote, men trained to arms from their infancy and animated by the love of liberty will afford neither a cheap or easy conquest, unquote. The Swiss immigrant John Jubilee, who was serving as a Georgia delegate to the Continental Congress, wrote a pamphlet entitled Great Britain's Right to Tax by a Swiss, which was published in London and Philadelphia. He warned that in a strong sense of liberty and the use of firearms almost from the cradle, the Americans have vastly the advantage over men of their rank of almost anywhere else in the world. Indeed, children were sheltering the resemblance of a gun before they were able to walk. The Americans will fight like men who have everything at stake, and their motto is death or freedom. The town of Gorham, Massachusetts, now part of the state of Maine, sent the British government a warning that even, quote, many of our women have been used to handling cartridges and can load a musket, unquote. It was feared that the Massachusetts gun confiscation was a prototype for the rest of America. For example, a newspaper article published in 3 colonies reported that when the new British generals arrived, they would order everyone in America to deliver up their arms by a certain date. The events of April the 19th convinced many more Americans to arm themselves and to embody independent militia. A report from New York City observed that the inhabitants there are arming themselves, forming companies, and taking every method to defend our rights. The like spirit prevails in the province of New Jersey, where a large and very well-disciplined militia are now fit for action. In Virginia, Lord Dunmore observed, quote, every county is now arming a company of men whom they call an independent company for the avowed purpose of protecting their community and to be employed against government if occasion require, unquote. North Carolina's royal governor, Joshua Martin, issued a proclamation outlawing independent militia, but it had little effect. A Virginia gentleman wrote a letter to a Scottish friend explaining in America, "We are all in arms, exercising and training old and youth to use of a gun. No person goes abroad without his sword or gun or pistol. Every plan is full of armed men who all wear a hunting shirt on the left breast of which are sewed in very legible letters, liberty or death." The British escalated the war. Royal Admiral Samuel Graves ordered that all seaports north of Boston be burned. When the British Navy showed up at what was then known as Flatmouth, Massachusetts, today it's Portland, Maine, the town attempted to negotiate. The townspeople gave up 8 muskets, which was hardly sufficient, and so Flatmouth was destroyed by naval bombardment. The next year, 13 colonies would adopt the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration listed the tyrannical acts of King George III, including his methods for carrying out gun control. Listen to this very carefully. "He has plundered our seas, ravaged our coasts, burned our towns, and destroyed the lives of our people." As the war went on, the British always remembered that without gun control, they could never control America. And I will say that again. As the Revolutionary War went on, the British always remembered that without gun control, they could never control America. In 1777, with British victory seeming likely at that time period, Colonial Undersecretary William Knox drafted a plan entitled, quote, "What is fit to be done with America," unquote. Listen to what I'm about to read very carefully, because the New World Order is using this exact same plan to attempt to enslave us. To ensure there would be no future rebellions, the militia laws should be replaced and none suffered to be reenacted. And the arms of all the people should be taken away. Nor should any foundry of manufacture of arms, gunpowder, or warlike stores be ever suffered in America. Nor should any gunpowder, lead, arms, or ordnance be imported into America without a license. Now, if you heard what I just read, the New World Order is attempting the exact same tyranny. To the Americans of the Revolution and the founding era, the theory of the same late 20th century courts that the Second Amendment is a collective right and not an individual right may have seemed incomprehensible. The Americans owned guns individually in their homes. They owned guns collectively in their armories and powder houses. They would not allow the British to confiscate their individual arms nor their collective arms. And when the British tried to do both, the Revolution began. The Americans used their individual arms and their collective arms to fight against the confiscation of any arms. Americans fought to provide themselves a government that would never perpetuate the abuse that had provoked the Revolutionary War in the first place. And that still holds true today, ladies and gentlemen. When our government attempts to talk about gun control and gun confiscation, a revolution is not what we need. We need a restoration, a great restoration of constitutional Republican government. And if we have to bend our so-called representatives over our knees and blister their little asses and remind them that we are the boss, then that's just what we have to do. But don't let anyone ever talk you into revolution. Revolution is something communists and socialists like to scream about. Our government works perfectly fine if we allow it to work. Our government is the Constitution of the United States of America. So don't ever let anyone trick you into believing we need a revolution. We need a restoration, a great American restoration of constitutional Republican government. That's what we need. And this is the end of this particular broadcast. Long live liberty. Long live the Republic. Long live the Constitution of the United States. And death to the New World Order.